The door was already half open when he said it, his voice steady in a way that scared me more than shouting ever could. "If you walk out now, don't call me." I stopped with my hand on the knob. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in that narrow hallway, the clock ticking behind him like it was keeping score. This wasn't a fight anymore. It felt like a line being drawn, clean and permanent. I remember thinking how strange it was that after all those years of shared meals and quiet mornings, everything had narrowed down to that single sentence. I didn't turn around. My throat tightened, not from anger, but from the weight of understanding what he was really asking me to choose. "Then I started, and for a moment I didn't know how to finish the thought, because whatever came next was going to change the rest of my life. Before that night, my life looked ordinary from the outside. I was in my early 40s, married, with a job that paid the bills and a routine that rarely surprised anyone. I lived about 20 minutes from my father, close enough to check in, far enough to pretend I had my own orbit. People would have said we were a normal father and son. We talked on birthdays, shared holidays, exchanged news about work and health. Nothing dramatic, nothing broken, at least not visibly. He had raised me alone after my mother died. I was 12, old enough to understand loss, but too young to know how to carry it. He never spoke much about her after the funeral. He handled grief the way he handled everything else, by tightening his jaw and moving forward. That became the rhythm of our house. Silence wasn't awkward, it was normal. Feelings weren't denied, just postponed indefinitely. He worked long hours, came home tired, cooked simple meals, and expected the same discipline from me that he demanded of himself. There was no cruelty in it, but there was little softness either. Praise was rare. Approval came in practical forms: a repaired bike, tuition paid on time, a nod instead of a hug. I learned early that love, in our family, was something you inferred, not something you heard out loud. As I grew older, I followed the path he respected. I went to college, got a stable job, didn't make waves. On paper, I became the kind of man he could quietly point to with pride. But somewhere along the way, I started to feel like I was living inside a version of myself that had been approved in advance. I didn't know how to name that feeling back then. I only knew it felt tight, like a coat that fit when I was younger, but my father aged the way he had lived, slowly, rigidly, refusing help until it was unavoidable. He was still sharp, still authoritative, still convinced that experience automatically meant correctness. When we disagreed, it wasn't explosive. It was colder than that. He would listen, then dismiss, then move on as if the conversation had resolved itself simply because he had decided it had. I told myself this was just how he was. That real-life experience teaches you to accept people as they come. That family loyalty meant adjusting your expectations, not challenging the structure. For years, that logic kept the peace. But it also kept something inside me unresolved, like a question that never got asked because I was afraid of the answer. By the time that night arrived, the tension hadn't come from a single argument. It had accumulated quietly, through small decisions I made without his approval, opinions I softened before sharing, choices I delayed because I didn't want to explain them. I didn't yet realize how much weight those small acts of avoidance were carrying. I only knew that something in our relationship was no longer neutral, and pretending otherwise was starting to cost me more than I could afford. The incident itself didn't arrive with drama. No slammed doors, no raised voices, just a conversation that had waited too long to happen. I had gone to his house on a weekday evening after work. He'd called earlier and said he needed help sorting through some paperwork. Medical forms, insurance letters, Things he claimed were getting out of hand. That alone told me something had shifted. He never admitted overwhelm. When I arrived, the house smelled like dust and old coffee, the same way it always had, but the silence felt heavier than usual. We sat at the kitchen table, papers spread between us. At first, it was practical. I explained forms. He nodded. Then he asked, almost casually, what my plans were, long-term. The way he said it, flat, evaluative, made my shoulders tense. I told him I was considering a job offer in another state. Nothing final yet, just considering. He stopped sorting papers, looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Another state meant distance. It meant I wouldn't be available the way he'd come to expect. It meant I was choosing something without factoring him in as the final authority. He didn't say any of that directly. He didn't have to. I'd known him long enough to hear what stayed unsaid. He told me it was irresponsible, said I had obligations, said family doesn't just leave. His words were controlled, almost reasonable, which somehow made them sharper. I tried to explain, slowly, carefully, that this wasn't about abandoning anyone, that I needed a change, that I had been feeling stuck for years. Saying it out loud felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice I wasn't sure would hold. That's when he leaned back and crossed his arms. A gesture I remembered from childhood. Final, defensive. So, this is what it comes to, he said, after everything. Something in me tightened, not anger, fatigue. I realized, with startling clarity, that no explanation would ever be enough. The story of my life, when told by me, would always sound like a betrayal to him if it didn't match the version he'd approved. I told him I wasn't asking for permission, that I needed him to trust that I knew what I was doing. The room went quiet. The clock on the wall kept ticking, loud and indifferent. He stood up, slowly, like he was steadying himself, and said the sentence that would follow me long after that night. If you walk out now, don't call me. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was delivered like a fact, the way you tell someone the bridge is out ahead. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't about the job anymore. It was about control, about loyalty, about whether I was still willing to live inside the boundaries he'd drawn decades ago. I stood there, realizing this was the point of no return. Staying would mean shrinking again. Leaving would mean losing something I wasn't sure I could ever replace. For the first time, the choice wasn't theoretical. It was immediate. And whatever I did next would define our relationship in a way no apology could undo. After that night, nothing resolved itself. There was no clean break, no dramatic exit that settled the matter. Instead, everything slowed down and tightened, like a knot being pulled one small turn at a time. I didn't take the job right away. That was my first mistake. I told myself I needed time, that things might soften if I didn't force the issue. In reality, I was afraid of proving him right, afraid of becoming the son who chose distance over duty. So I stayed where I was, physically close, but emotionally out of alignment, trying to live as if that sentence hadn't been spoken. Our conversations became strained. He was polite, almost formal, as though I were a colleague instead of his son. He asked about work, about my wife, about surface-level things, but never about my plans. The silence around that topic grew heavier than any argument. When I visited, I felt like a guest who had overstayed his welcome without ever being told to leave. At the same time, my own life started to feel brittle. The job I once tolerated now felt unbearable. Each day carried the quiet knowledge that I was delaying a decision that couldn't be postponed forever. At home, my wife noticed the change in me before I admitted it to myself. I was distracted, short-tempered, distant in a way that scared her. When she asked what was wrong, I told her I was tired. It was easier than explaining that I felt like I was slowly disappearing inside my own routine. Then my father's health faltered. Not dramatically, but enough to shift the balance. A fall. A short hospital stay. Suddenly, the unspoken expectation became spoken again. This time through logistics. Appointments. Errands. Being available just in case. Every time my phone rang, I felt a flicker of resentment followed immediately by guilt. I hated myself for feeling trapped by responsibility to the man who had taught me to value it above everything else. The job offer didn't wait. The company followed up, asking for a decision. I delayed again, telling them I needed more time. Each delay felt like a small surrender. I could hear my father's voice in my head, calm and certain, telling me what a reasonable man would do. At the same time, another voice, quieter, less practiced, kept reminding me that time was no longer neutral. Every day I chose not to act, I was choosing something else instead. When I finally tried to talk to him again, to explain that this wasn't an act of rebellion but of survival, he shut it down quickly. He said he didn't want to revisit old conversations. That hurt more than the ultimatum. It told me that, in his mind, the matter was already settled. The terms had been set. All that remained was whether I would comply. I started sleeping poorly. Woke up in the early hours with the same thought looping in my head. If I stayed, I would resent him. If I left, I would lose him. There was no option that didn't involve loss. The pressure didn't come from shouting or threats anymore. It came from the quiet accumulation of consequences, from realizing that the life I was living was slowly diverging from the person I was becoming. By then, the choice was no longer about a job or a move. It was about whether I would continue shaping my decisions around fear of disappointment or finally accept the cost of telling the truth, even if it meant walking away from the one relationship that had defined me since childhood. The final moment didn't happen in a rush. It arrived on a quiet afternoon, almost politely, which somehow made it harder to escape. I was standing in my kitchen, holding the phone, listening to the recruiter explain, again, that the offer wouldn't remain open. They needed an answer by the end of the day. I thanked her, said I understood, and hung up. The house was silent. I could hear the refrigerator hum, the distant sound of a car passing outside. Ordinary sounds, indifferent to the fact that something irreversible was pressing in on me. I sat down and realized my hands were shaking. I thought of my father alone in his house, moving slower than he used to, pretending he didn't need help. I thought of the boy I had been, learning early that love was conditional on obedience, that approval had edges you weren't supposed to test. And then I thought of myself as I was now, tired, stalled, living a real-life experience that no longer felt like my own. I drove to his place without calling first. He answered the door with the same guarded expression he'd worn for months. We stood there, two men facing each other, both waiting for the other to adjust. "I got a deadline," I said. My voice surprised me. It was steady. "I have to decide today." He didn't invite me in. He didn't need to. He told me calmly that I already knew how he felt, that choices have consequences, that some decisions tell you who matters most. Something inside me finally gave way. Not loudly, not violently, just enough to let the truth through. I told him I wasn't doing this to hurt him, that I wasn't walking away from him, even if it looked that way, that I had spent most of my life trying to be the son he could live with, and somewhere along the line, I had stopped being a man I could live with. He shook his head once, a small motion, full of finality. "If you walk out now," he said again, Don't call me. I felt the weight of that sentence settle fully this time. I understood that staying wouldn't preserve our relationship. It would only delay its collapse. I also understood that leaving meant accepting a loss I couldn't fix. "Then I'll go," I said quietly. I didn't wait for a response. I turned, walked down the steps, and felt something tear loose inside me. Not relief, not freedom, but a clean, undeniable certainty. The choice was made. The cost was real. And there was no version of the future where I could pretend otherwise. In the months that followed, the silence held. I moved. I took the job. Life reorganized itself around new streets, new routines, new names at work I had to learn. On the surface, it looked like progress, a fresh start. But inside, everything felt unfinished, like a sentence cut off mid-thought. I checked my phone more often than I needed to, even though I already knew what wouldn't be there. I didn't call him, not because I didn't want to, but because I had been asked not to. Respecting that boundary felt like honoring the last thing he'd been clear about. It was a strange form of loyalty, one that hurt more than defiance ever had. I heard about him through fragments. A neighbor mentioned he'd stopped going out as much. A distant relative said he seemed the same as always, which I learned meant quieter, smaller. Each update landed like a reminder that distance doesn't freeze time. It just changes how you witness its passing. My wife asked once if I regretted it. I told her the truth. Regret wasn't the right word. There were days I missed him so sharply it felt physical. Other days, I felt a steady calm I hadn't known before. Both could exist at the same time. That was the part no one prepares you for. The way a decision can be both right and costly. Sometimes I replay that moment at the door, not to rewrite it, but to understand it. I see now that my father wasn't trying to punish me. He was defending the only language of love he knew, one built on proximity, duty, and control. Letting me go would have meant admitting that his way wasn't the only way. I don't think he could do that. Not then. As for me, I learned that responsibility doesn't disappear when you choose yourself. It just changes shape. I carry him with me, in my silences, in my hesitation to ask for help, in the way I still measure my choices against an invisible standard. That's the inheritance I didn't know I was accepting. We never reconciled. There was no final conversation, no closure wrapped in forgiveness. Just time, moving forward, indifferent and steady. I don't tell this story as a lesson. I tell it as a memory, a record of a choice made when time was no longer neutral. Some doors close loudly. Others close the way ours did, without a sound, leaving you to feel the echo for the rest of your life.